A ceramic sculpture of a boar at the Cleveland Museum of Art didn't always grab much attention. Back before 2018, the small vessel was on display along with other ancient pottery, but then it became an internet meme, and then it became extremely famous, and then questions started to come up around whether or not the sculpture was even authentic.
It's a never-ending study.
That's Seth Pevnik, the curator of Greek and Roman art at the Cleveland Museum of Art.
We'll never know everything about everything in the collection, so there are always more things to discover.
You're listening to Cleveland Magazine's Cleveland Connection podcast, where we take a closer look at the stories and surprising connections to Northeast Ohio and pop culture. My name is Annie Nikoloff. The Boar Vessel meme is pretty silly. According to knowyourmeme.com, it all started in 2015 when a Facebook page posted a picture of the artwork with a back and forth text conversation between two people that reads, "Me, hey girl, what's up? Her, I only date Boar Vessel 600 to 500 BC Etruscan ceramic." A few years passed, and then the meme took off to new heights in 2018 with a whole Boar Vessel meme subreddit page dedicated to it. And that really could have been where the story ended. But there's actually a lot more to this story. The meme created so much attention that archaeologists and historians poked around and saw that the Boar Vessel's historical features weren't quite adding up. And it led to a slew of tests and research from the conservators and curators at the Cleveland Museum of Art, which all led to a change in how we understand this piece of artwork today. I had a fascinating conversation with Seth Pevnik, along with the Cleveland Museum of Art's Colleen Snyder, the conservator of objects, and Jacqueline Bond, the director of communications, to hear more about the Boar Vessel's journey and whether or not it's a total fake. What was it like to see all this attention driven at this, relatively small, physically small piece of artwork that you have in your collection?
Staff internally, I think we thought it was delightful that people were so enthusiastic. I think especially those of us who work on ancient Greek and Roman materials and have studied that, it was kind of great to see, something from that collection take off. And, and we just found, the creativity I think that people had with creating those memes. I mean, we were laughing about the one where, how does he wear his pants? I mean, it was very funny, very creative. And I think in general, I mean, we always enjoy when, our guests, our visitors are creative with what they see and find ways to, share how it inspires them.
I think it kind of changes the context around a piece too. And I noticed when I was at the museum last and I was in the Art Lens gallery and there was the Boar Vessel and it talked about how it was a meme and you kind of like interacted with this new tab of history on it. I was wondering, as curators, like how do you sort of incorporate these modern contextual, sometimes very silly advancements in our understanding of art? Like how does that incorporate into your work in displaying it and understanding it?
Well, maybe I can fill in some of what happened in between 2018 and the current display. So I was hired at the end of 2018 and joined the museum in 2019. And one of the first things that I was asked to do was to look at the Boar Vessel. I think probably because of these memes, it got some new attention, not only from visitors, but also from experts. And someone had suggested to the museum that this vessel might not be an authentic ancient vessel. And so when I came in as the new curator of Greek and Roman art, I was asked to look at that. And initially, I agreed with that person who was doubting it. Not that it was definitely fake, but that it was a little odd and worth looking into. And the things that are odd about it are that the sort of what we call the fabric of the vessel, the way that the clay has been treated and fired, is like what we would call bucero ware. And that's something, or impasto ware, that's something that we see in ancient Italy as early as the 7th century BC. But the form of the vessel, it's pretty realistic looking, right? It looks like a boar. That's something that we don't see at the time that vessels were being made in this kind of fabric. So we start to see vessels that look, how we might say, realistic in form. We start to see realistic looking boars around the 4th century BC. And so these two things don't overlap with one another. And that's the kind of red flag that scholars see and say, something's not right here. This might not be ancient. Of course, as archaeologists, we find things all the time that seem a little bit odd and change the way that we think about things from antiquity. So the fact that the three-dimensional form and the treatment of the surface don't seem to go together doesn't mean it must be fake. But it was enough to raise the question, right? And so I started looking, because one answer to that might just be, well, you haven't looked at enough vessels. And so if you start looking at other collections in other museums and in publications, you might realize, oh, I was wrong. It's rare, but it's not unique. But I couldn't find any other examples. And so it seemed still to be unique. And so I came and talked to Colleen about it, and I think she thought the same thing I did. And we talked about what sorts of analyses we could do to try to show more definitively, yes, it is ancient, or no, it's actually modern. The kind of testing that we did is called thermoluminescence, and Colleen can probably explain that better than I can.
What Seth is saying, I think that happens a lot, especially with the ancient collection, is that, we want to be really careful to try to back up what we think about something with scientific evidence if possible, because, what if it is a one-of-a-kind example? So we wanted to proceed very kind of systematically. So we did visual examination under the microscope. We looked at it carefully. We were trying to look and see, was there anything that stood out that seemed unusual or might give us more information about whether it was ancient or modern. And we also we do this a lot, we use ultraviolet light. And so we can look at the fluorescence, and often and we have found in the ancient Greek and Roman collection, sometimes people try to, add a little more decoration with some paint or, make it a little more fancy. We were looking for something like that might have showed up as a type of fluorescence and indicated something to us. And we weren't finding anything that were really like any red flags or anything very unusual. We can take x-rays here on site of the artwork, and we do that a lot to help us understand them. So we took the vessel for an x-ray to look at the structure. It's hollow. So we wanted to see, did it look like it was manufactured in an appropriate way, or was it made using inconsistent or unusual techniques? But it looked like it was made more or less the way we would expect an ancient vessel to be constructed like that. And we were also able to see that even the repairs, because some of the legs have been broken and repaired, all the clay within even those repaired areas looked like it was the same density. So it was all consistent, and those pieces all belonged to the same vessel. So then we moved to what Seth is talking about, which is thermoluminescence. So what that tells us is the date that the vessel was originally fired. Clay is a very crystalline material, and it absorbs radiation from the environment around it when it's in the ground, and it gets kind of trapped in some of that crystalline matrix. And then when somebody takes the clay and refines it and forms it into a vessel, and then when they fire it, that amount of heat releases all that trapped energy. So at that point, that's kind of what we often call the zeroing out point. And then from the time it's fired until now, it is started accumulating radiation again. So what we can do is we can take some very small drilled samples of the ceramic. We do it in the dark with a little safe light so that we're not exposing it to any light that might affect the results of the test. So we drilled a couple small samples and we send them off to a lab for analysis, and they heat those small samples, and they're able to measure the amount of energy released in the form of light, and that tells them approximately how long ago it was fired. So yeah, it's a very cool technique.
This is fascinating. And the level of study that you guys have put into the Boar Vessel in response to, to be honest, it's just like a silly thing online. It's just, I think, amazing to like get an understanding of it. So thank you for walking me through it. So all those tests, what did they reveal? Did it show that it's, it is legitimate? Are there other tests that you're looking to do, or where do you kind of stand in the study of this piece?
We did do one more test where we were able to take more samples of the ceramic, and we did something called neutron activation analysis. And that's basically looking for kind of a chemical signature of the elements that are present in the clay. And they're able to compare that with databases of existing, known sites of where clay is obtained and kind of match it to a general geographic region. And Seth, I remember that came back as being around kind of the region of Rome where the clay was from, which
Right.
was maybe not all that unusual if that's where we're expecting it to be from.
Right. So that test looked okay, right? If it had come back and said the clay was from Ohio, that would have been a big problem. So that was good. But if you've been to Rome and visited archaeological sites and museums around Italy, you know that you can buy lots of replicas of objects, and it wouldn't be surprising if those kinds of things were made from local clay. The TL test came back saying it had been fired most recently within the last 100 years. So and it can't be more precise than that. The precision is based on the cycles of radioactive decay. So in some time periods, it can give you a time span of a few decades, and sometimes it's a span of a few centuries. So we wouldn't expect it to come back and say it was fired in 1975. But the fact that it was fired in the last 100 years is not really good for the antiquity of the Boar Vessel. There are some reasons why you might get an anomaly like that with an ancient vessel, right? So if it had been fired more than 2,000 years ago, like we would expect for this kind of vessel, and then somehow was in a house fire or something more recently, that would reset that clock that Colleen was talking about. But it doesn't look like it has been in a recent fire. And we already had those doubts that I talked about earlier. So for those reasons, I think it's probably a modern forgery. We can't be 100% sure. And so on the CMA website, I leave open both possibilities. Either it was made between 700 and 500 BCE, or it was made in the 20th century. I think it's more likely that it was made in the 20th century. The fact that the clay seems likely to have come from central Italy might actually help us to solve the mystery. I think the only way that we could have certainty about this would be if we met someone who said, I'm the guy who made this. I made it in the 1960s or the 1970s. And so far, we haven't been able to do that. There's one other piece of research that I did that I can add that still doesn't help us really solve the problem. But this was purchased by the museum from a dealer in New York in the 1970s. And that dealer's archives are now in Los Angeles at the Getty Research Institute. And so in 2019, when I was in LA for something else, I went to the GRI and I requested all those files and spent a few hours looking through these archives. And I found finally, after looking through many, many other files, in a file that was labeled Greek and Roman copies and fakes, I found a black and white photograph of this vessel. And initially when I found it and it was in that folder, I thought, oh my gosh, it's definitely a copy or a fake. But then I realized that was probably not the original filing system of the dealer. I think that when those archives went to the GRI, a librarian or an archivist probably put them in an order that made sense. And just like I said at the beginning, when I was asked to look at this vessel, I thought it was likely a fake. The person who organized those photographs probably thought that looks like a fake. So that wasn't exactly a smoking gun either. that was in 2019, I think. So then we decided to take the vessel off view because it had been on view in a gallery that was for ancient art. And we were pretty sure it's not ancient art. So we took it off view. I did talk at the time about leaving it on view because I knew people liked it and just updating the label. But institutionally, that's not what we do. We have other fakes and forgeries in our collection, and they're just not usually on view. Then I started being asked by people in the galleries and by our guards, what happened to the boar? We want to see the boar. Where is it? And I would explain, and I would say you should look on the website because the website explains a little bit more about it. And that didn't entirely please everybody. Then you might remember in 2021, after we reopened after the pandemic, there was a show called Stories from Storage. And my contribution to Stories from Storage was a group of objects. It was called Replication and Reinterpretation, I think. And it talked about the fact that in ancient art, we sometimes see the same kinds of images and forms over and over again, whether it's Etruscans borrowing from Greeks, or Romans borrowing from Greeks, or Romans borrowing from Romans, right? Reinterpreting their own imagery. And there was also a small part of that show that was about modern reinterpretations. And I think you then get into this very interesting question of what constitutes a fake. And I think it has to do with the intention, right? And again, if we ever find the guy who made this thing in the 20th century, he could tell us, or she could tell us, oh, I wasn't trying to fool anyone. I just thought this was a fun sort of vessel to make, right? It was my own take on how an ancient person might have made a boar vessel. In that case, it's not really a fake or a forgery. It's more like a reinterpretation of something. So without knowing the intent, I think it's hard to classify this object more specifically. But it was fun to have it back on view for that show. And so then we had the idea, well, maybe after that show, maybe it can go back on view, but not in the ancient art galleries, but instead in the Art Lens gallery, which is all about different ways of interacting with art. Our colleagues in the digital department had made a digital 3D model of the vessel, so you can see that on our website. And so now it's on view there, and I think that people really enjoy it. And I'm not sure whether the boar will get to be in the next iteration of Art Lens. We'll see.
Seth, I also think it's been really great to use the story of the Boar Vessel as a chance for educational purposes, whether they're adult tours or for younger audiences. I mean, I feel like it will live on in that respect, even if it doesn't go back on view in Art Lens, or, I think there are other ways that it will still be important to the collection and the story that it tells.
And going back to those memes, right? Those are still fun, whether it was made in antiquity or just a few decades ago.
And I think also, just to wrap up the story of the study by saying that, we keep really meticulous records here in curatorial and conservation. So all these things that we did are, recorded, every single part of the process of testing and the results. And, so it may be if someday there are different methods of analysis available to future conservators, or somebody wants to revisit this question or has different opinions, or I don't know, maybe they find another Boar vessel and they want to compare the two. They'll have that information to work with.
I feel like you mentioned, the story, I've learned so much just hearing you guys talk about how you go about investigating this scenario. And I'm sure these are techniques and strategies that you use for so many other pieces of art. So it's just really illuminating to what you guys do behind the scenes to make this museum a reality. So thank you for sharing that. And I just have to ask, let's say the meme never happened. Let's say it never popped up. Would this still be on display as an ancient artifact? Seth, I know you came on after all of this. Is this something that you probably would have poked around on anyway? I'm just curious if the meme is the motivating factor towards this conclusion and all this work that's gone towards it.
I think I would have looked into it eventually. It wouldn't have been so top of mind, probably. Some of the things that we talked about doing, we can do for all of the objects in the collection, but we don't do X-rays and thermoluminescence or neutron activation analysis for most objects. right? The x-rays we can do in-house, but it's still a big commitment of people's time and energy. The scientific analyses, the TL and the NAA, we have to send those out to labs elsewhere, and it's expensive, and we don't have an unlimited budget. So yeah, it may be that the memes made this one worth spending the extra time and money on. We do those kinds of analyses on objects that are especially interesting and important both to our institution and to our colleagues elsewhere. So I know partly because of the meme and partly because of the research that we've done, I have colleagues, curators at other museums who know about the Boar Vessel, and I'm sure that Colleen does too. I guess I can't answer your question absolutely, but I think, yeah, the meme probably played into it to a certain extent. Certainly, that's one of the reasons why when it went off view, people noticed and were asking about it, right? Other things go away and only a few people notice.
And I think, Seth, we've had a great number of projects with similar questions, and I feel like you're always evaluating what's in the collection and asking those questions, and then we're deciding what makes sense to how to answer those questions. And I think just to expand about talking about why we might not do it on everything as well is it's not just the expense of time and money, but I think specifically for some of those types of analyses, like we have to take physical samples. And so that material is destroyed. And it's only a tiny bit of material. And we would only do if it was safe for the object, but we also want to make sure that it's meaningful, that we're really considering is it appropriate to take a little bit of this material that's going to be destroyed in the process of analyzing it to get this answer? Is this what we need to do?
And as the Boar Vessel continues into the future, I'd love to hear more about how you've seen it be embraced in sort of these unique ways beyond the meme, too.
From a marketing standpoint, I have two sort of funny things. This is a social media post where we announced that the Boar Vessel is back on view in the Artlands Gallery. It has 1.7 million views without any paid push or anything behind it. Completely organic, 132,000 likes on Instagram alone. So I think if we're just talking about, maybe motivating somebody who doesn't come to the museum as frequently to come visit and see the Artlands Gallery, I think that can be an excellent tool for engagement. I recently spoke to a group of Cleveland Institute of Art students that were in an arts administration class. And at the end of the class, we were like, oh, does anybody have any questions? Do you want my business card? Do you want to connect? And a few of the students were like, hey, we have something we really want to show you. Come up to our studio. And we went up to the studio and they had hundreds of Boar vessels that they 3D printed in various colors and sizes. And the Cleveland Institute of Art did a partnership with us for the launch of the Transformer Station under the Cleveland Museum of Art, kind of co-curated previously with the Bidwells. But they put their Boar Vessel work on display during the show Love is Resistance, which did contain a lot of more politically motivated work. And then there was just this display case that was full of Boar vessels. So I think it's a good way to put your finger on the pulse of younger people, art students. Our collection online also being an important part of that. You're able to get all of the metadata, the high resolution version of the image. We also do some 3D modeling that's available through the collection online. So I think while it's silly, this meme culture kind of does result in a net positive for engagement for the museum. And I love it. I think it's hilarious.
I love that so much. And I would love just seeing you walk into a room that's just filled with tiny Boar vessels.
We didn't know what we were walking into, and we were like, oh, all right.
Wow.
They really like the Boar Vessel.
I'm curious too, this is such a big one that we're talking about here, but are there any other pieces that you've noticed like capture attention, even kind of like this, or become memes at the CMA? I'm just kind of curious if anything else has sparked this type of discourse online.
I mean, there's a lot of artwork in our collection that are crowd favorites for a lot of reasons. The portrait of Nathaniel Olds, he kind of looks like he's wearing like the Google glasses. I've seen people tag us, like they dress up as him for Halloween. Daggett Sharkies, also another CMA classic, has taken on a lot of different forms. We had this local company, Found Surface. They did digital loom, so they were able to recreate the artwork, but as a throw blanket. But a really gorgeous, one-of-a-kind, unique made, locally made, way to take the collection home and be proud of the CMA. None of these things are memes, but I think that there are definitely artworks in our collection that for one reason or another have become popularized. And the collection online, I think, is a big way that people can make it into prints or objects that they can, have on their walls or in their offices. And I think that kind of helps build a connection with the works that we have on display.
I think the collection online is so amazing that because the collection is open access, not in particular a meme, but I think one of our paintings appeared in the Bridgerton series. And, I feel like our stuff ends up everywhere. And I just enjoy seeing how people are using the open access material and turning it into something, new.
There's a million examples, but I think that's one of the more recent ones. And I love when people dress up like works from our collection for Halloween. I think that that's also really cool.
That's awesome. I'm eager to see someone dress up like the Boar Vessel for Halloween. How you
it could be you. And
right?
And then you can send us pictures.
You
Yeah.
could probably
You're right.
do a really
You're
cool
right.
paper mache outfit.
There's always a Cleveland connection if you know where to look. And you've just heard about one with the story behind the Boar Vessel meme from the Cleveland Museum of Art. Thank you to the wonderful historians at the museum for the interview. You can see images of the real Boar Vessel along with tons of the museum's other items in its collections at the Cleveland Museum of Art's website, clevelandart.org, and you can find some of the old memes we discussed at the Boar Vessel Reddit page. Thank you to Nihilore for the song Phantasms, which you're hearing behind me right now and also heard at the beginning of the podcast. Be sure to follow Cleveland Magazine online at clevelandmagazine.com, on social media, and in print for more stories like this one. I'm Annie Nikoloff. Thanks for listening to this episode of The Cleveland Connection.